What drives a person to pull the trigger after sharing intimacy? Why does society still fail those who live on its margins? Or perhaps, most hauntingly, could this tragedy have been avoided if fear and prejudice weren't such powerful forces? Before we dive in, let me say this. Only the people closest to Jamal truly know what happened that day. The rest of us are left piecing together fragments, trying to make sense of something that feels almost impossible to understand. And maybe that's why you're here. Maybe you've got questions too. I promised you answers to all this. But before we get ahead of ourselves, let's take a moment. Before we begin, our thoughts and deepest condolences go out to the family and friends of Jamal Broom, a vibrant soul whose life was tragically taken far too soon. Her laughter, her energy, her light. They're gone from this world, but not forgotten. Now, ask yourself this. What compels someone to commit an act so brutal it shakes an entire community? Today we unravel the harrowing story of Jamal Broom, a transgender woman whose kindness lit up the lives of those around her. Until one fateful day in February 2020 changed everything. Who was she? What brought her to that apartment complex in Detroit? And more importantly, why did someone feel the need to silence her permanently? Jamal, a beloved member of the LGBTQ community, was fatally shot after meeting a man she had connected with through her work as an escort. But what led to this horrifying crime? Was it about hiding his identity, as he claimed? Or was there something darker at play, something rooted in bias, desperation, or even greed? Let that sink in for a moment, because this isn't just a story about a murder. It's a stark reminder of the dangers faced by marginalized communities and the urgent need for acceptance and protection. It's also a call to action, for justice, for change, and for remembering Jamal not as a headline, but as a human being. And here's where you come in. You might hear details in this video that raise more questions than answers. That's okay. In fact, I want you to sit with those questions. Share them in the comments below. Let's talk about it later. Welcome to Fatal Fame, where all our stories are based on true crimes. Please support us by subscribing to this channel and clicking the notification bell icon so you don't miss any of our latest stories. This channel thrives on thoughtful discussion, and your voice matters. So, stick around. Before we dive deeper into what happened that day, let's pause and focus on the person at the center of this story, Jamal Broom. Because while news outlets might reduce her life to a headline, those who knew her will tell you she was so much more than that. She wasn't just a name in the paper. She was someone who brought light into the lives of everyone around her. If you're here to understand the tragedy, take a moment to remember who Jamal was, not just how her life ended. Jamal Broom wasn't just another face in the crowd. She was a beacon of light in her family and friends' lives. A transgender woman who embraced her identity despite societal challenges, Jamal radiated confidence, humor, and intelligence. Humor and intelligence. People who met her, even briefly, often said she left an impression. Maybe it was the way she could walk into the darkest room and find some light in it. Or maybe it was her ability to make people feel seen and valued when they needed it most. Her Aunt Patricia described her perfectly. She was the brightest light in the darkest room. Others remembered her as funny, smart, full of energy. Someone who could turn any gloomy situation around with her presence alone. To know Jamal was to love her. But like many navigating life as part of marginalized communities, Jamal faced struggles too. She dreamed of living authentically, freely and without judgment, a dream shared by so many but often denied to those who dare to live outside society's rigid lines. Despite the obstacles, Jamal found joy where she could. She loved making people laugh, whether through witty banter or simply being herself. She had a magnetic personality that drew people in, and once you were in her orbit, you didn't want to leave. To make ends meet, Jamal worked as an escort and ran an OnlyFans account. Let's be clear, her profession doesn't define her worth, nor does it justify what happened to her. Those close to her emphasized time and again that Jamal was not her job. She was a human being, a daughter, a niece, a friend, who did what she needed to survive in a world that often makes survival harder for people like her. What defined Jamal was the love and positivity she shared with the world, not the stigma attached to how she supported herself. Her family wants her remembered for the light she brought to their lives, not through the lens of stereotypes or prejudice. If you've ever wondered what it means to live courageously, Jamal's story offers a glimpse. Here was someone who chose to embrace her truth fully, even when the world around her wasn't always kind. She transitioned from male to female because it aligned with who she truly was inside, and in doing so, she became fulfilled and productive in ways that inspired those around her. Being part of the LGBTQ community wasn't just something Jamal did. It was integral to who she was. It gave her happiness, purpose, and a sense of belonging. And yet, tragically, it may have also made her a target in ways we'll explore later. Her family describes her as down-to-earth, someone whom people naturally gravitated toward. She was innocent, kind, and incredibly intelligent, qualities that made her unforgettable to those fortunate enough to cross her path. One relative mentioned how Jamal could find humor in almost anything, even during tough times. Another recalled her sharp mind, saying she had a knack for seeing solutions where others only saw problems. These aren't just fond memories. They're testaments to the kind of person Jamal was. Someone whose absence leaves a void that can never be filled. Now, I know some of you might be wondering why we're spending so much time talking about Jamal instead of jumping straight into the crime itself. But here's the thing. Understanding who she was helps us grasp the magnitude of what was lost. This wasn't just a random act of violence. It was the theft of a life brimming with potential, love, and light. And if there's one thing I want you to take away from this video, it's that behind every statistic, every headline, every case file, there's a real person. Someone like Jamal. So, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Did something resonate with you about Jamal's story? Do you have questions about how we honor victims like her while still seeking justice? Drop a comment below. I'm here to engage, answer, and keep the conversation going. After all, stories like Jamal's deserve to be remembered, discussed, and learned from. Let's do that together. Before we get into the details of what happened that morning, let's set the scene. Because understanding where this tragedy unfolded helps us piece together not just the how, but the why. And trust me, the setting plays a role in this story. A quiet, unassuming backdrop that makes what happened all the more haunting. On February 9th, 2025, Detroit woke up to one of those cold winter mornings that feel almost too still, too quiet. The kind of morning where the snow blankets everything, muffling sound and creating an eerie calm. It was around 10:15 a.m. when that calm was shattered, at least for one neighborhood. Officers were dispatched to Riverstone Apartments after reports came in of an unresponsive person lying face down in the snow. If you've ever seen snowfall in Detroit, you know how deceiving it can be. It gives the illusion of peace, of serenity, but beneath that pristine white surface, life goes on, and sometimes so does violence. The quiet neighborhood, usually undisturbed, became the stage for something no one could have anticipated. Witnesses described hearing a loud noise, sharp, sudden, and unmistakable, followed by the sight of a light-complexioned male running from the area. He got into a bluish-grey vehicle, which investigators would later discover belonged to Jamal herself. That moment, the sound, the movement, the fleeing figure, was the first clue that something had gone terribly wrong. But at the time, no one knew just how wrong it was. What makes this even harder to process is knowing what led up to it. Earlier that morning, Jamal had agreed to meet Robert Ridges, a man she'd never met before, for what seemed like a routine encounter. She likely didn't think much of it. After all, this was part of her work. What happened next, though, remains etched in the minds of everyone who's heard about it. Was it random? Planned? A crime of opportunity, or something darker? These are the kinds of questions that keep people up at night, and they're exactly the kind of questions we'll explore as we move forward. Now, here's where I want to pause for a second. Think about this. If you were there that morning, walking through the snow, hearing that noise, seeing someone run, it might stick with you forever. Moments like these don't just change the lives of those directly involved. They ripple outward, touching witnesses, families, entire communities. So, if you've got thoughts about how environments shape crimes, or maybe you've been somewhere similar and felt that same eerie calm, I'd love to hear about it. Drop a comment below. Let's talk about it. After all, stories like this aren't just about facts. They're about connections, conversations, and understanding. Let's walk through what happened that morning, step by step. Because when you break it down, the timeline, the details, the small moments that might seem insignificant at first, it paints a clearer picture of how quickly everything went wrong. And maybe, just maybe, it helps us understand why. At 9:06 a.m., Jamal received a FaceTime call from Robert Ridges, a man she'd never met before, but agreed to meet as part of her work as an escort. It wasn't unusual for her. This was how she connected with clients. The call lasted about 3 minutes, nothing out of the ordinary. She told him she was available and they made plans to meet up. To Jamal, it probably felt like any other day, another client on her schedule. What she didn't know, and couldn't have known, was that this meeting would be her last. By 10:00 a.m., surveillance footage captured Jamal entering Riverstone Apartments, unaware of the danger awaiting her inside. She walked in like anyone else would, carrying herself with the same confidence and energy people remembered her for. Witnesses later described seeing her arrive, noting nothing unusual about her demeanor. But inside those walls, something shifted. Something turned deadly. After their meeting, witnesses reported hearing the two arguing about something before a single gunshot rang out, ending Jamal's life instantly. Neighbors heard raised voices, then silence. A loud noise, followed by the sight of a light-complexioned male fleeing the scene. He got into a bluish-grey vehicle, which investigators would later discover belonged to Jamal herself. That moment, the argument, the gunshot, the fleeing figure, was the beginning of a tragedy that left an entire community reeling. Detectives arrived on the scene shortly after reports came in of an unresponsive person lying face down in the snow. When they got there, they found Jamal's lifeless body. She had suffered a single gunshot wound to the right side of her head. Nearby, they discovered a spent 9mm casing, along with her damaged cell phone and Ohio driver's license. These items weren't just pieces of evidence. They were fragments of who Jamal was, reminders of the life cut tragically short. Using advanced technology, detectives began piecing together what led to that moment. They uncovered chilling details. Robert Ridges had made over 30 calls to sex workers that morning, all targeting black women, including members of the transgender community. 30 calls. Think about that for a second. This wasn't random or spontaneous. It was calculated, deliberate. Investigators believe Ridges specifically sought out transgender women, though he later tried to distance himself from that reality during interviews. But here's where things get even more complicated. When questioned, Ridges claimed he didn't know Jamal was transgender. He said he killed her because he panicked, afraid she'd tell others about their encounter. But the evidence tells a different story. Detectives recovered a stolen Sig Sauer Ninum handgun from his apartment, the same weapon used in the murder. Ballistic testing confirmed it matched the fatal bullet. And then there's this. When interviewed, Ridges admitted he didn't have money to pay for services. So why was he carrying a loaded handgun? Was this always part of his plan, or did fear and prejudice drive him to pull the trigger? Now, I want to pause here for a moment Because this is where the story gets heavy. Not just because of what happened, but because of the questions it raises. Why did Ridges feel the need to kill someone he barely knew? Was it about hiding his identity, as he claimed? Or was there something darker at play? Something rooted in bias, desperation, or even greed? These are the kinds of questions investigators wrestled with as they built their case against him. And let's talk about the aftermath for a second. After shooting Jamal, Ridges didn't stick around. He took her car, drove it to the opposite side of the apartment complex, parked it, and went back inside his own unit. Investigators believe he grabbed the gun and tried to cover his tracks. But what he didn't realize was that detectives were already onto him. Using technology and surveillance, they tracked his movements until they located him at MGM Grand Casino in Detroit. Within 11 hours of the murder, he was arrested, attempting to blend back into society as if nothing had happened. Here's the thing. Crimes like this don't happen in a vacuum. They're shaped by larger societal issues, prejudice, stigma, fear. And while we can't change what happened to Jamal, we can ask ourselves hard questions about how we treat marginalized communities. How do we create a world where someone like Jamal doesn't have to worry about walking into a situation like this? How do we hold people accountable without letting hate dictate justice? So now I want to hear from you. What stood out to you about the sequence of events? Do you think Ridges acted alone, or could there be more to the story? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'm here to engage, answer, and keep the conversation going. Stories like Jamal's deserve to be remembered, discussed, and learned from. Let's do that together. Let's take a closer look at how law enforcement pieced together the puzzle of Jamal Broom's murder. Because while it might seem like justice was swift, Ridges arrested within 11 hours of the crime. It wasn't just luck that led them there. It was meticulous work, advanced technology, and an unrelenting pursuit of answers. And trust me, what they uncovered along the way only deepened the complexity of this case. Within hours of discovering Jamal's body, detectives were already on the move. They didn't waste time. First, they tracked Ridges to his apartment, where they recovered a stolen Sig Sauer 9mm handgun. The same weapon used in the murder. This wasn't some random find. Ballistic testing later confirmed that the gun matched the fatal bullet, leaving no doubt about Ridges' involvement. But here's the thing. Finding the gun was just one piece of the puzzle. Investigators also uncovered other critical evidence at the scene. A spent 9mm casing lying in the snow near Jamal's body, her damaged cell phone, and even her Ohio driver's license. These items weren't just clues. They told a story of violence, desperation, and calculated intent. Shortly after searching his apartment, investigators located Ridges himself at MGM Grand Casino in Detroit. He was attempting to blend back into society as if nothing had happened. Imagine that for a second. Less than a day after taking someone's life, he's sitting at a casino trying to act normal. It's chilling when you think about it. Detectives describe their operation as complicated but precise, using surveillance and tactical strategies to bring him into custody without incident. When they finally confronted him, Ridges reportedly tried to run, but officers tackled him to the ground before he could get far. By the end of the day, he was under arrest, charged with second-degree murder, felony firearm possession, and carrying a concealed weapon. Now let's talk about the breakthroughs that really sealed the case. Phone records played a huge role. Investigators discovered that Ridges had made over 30 calls to sex workers that morning, all targeting black women, including members of the transgender community. 30 calls. Let that sink in for a moment. Was this coincidence, or was it part of a pattern? The evidence strongly suggests the latter. And then there's the matter of CCTV footage. Surveillance cameras captured Jamal entering Riverstone Apartments at exactly 10:00 a.m. Just minutes later, witnesses reported hearing arguing, followed by a loud noise and seeing a light-complexioned male fleeing the scene. Every detail lined up, painting a clear picture of what happened. and who was responsible. But here's where things get murky. During interviews, Ridges claimed he didn't know Jamal was transgender. He said he killed her because he panicked, afraid she'd tell others about their encounter. Sounds plausible, right? Except the evidence tells a different story. Remember those 33 phone calls? Detectives believe Ridges specifically sought out transgender women, not just randomly stumbled upon them. So why would he lie about knowing Jamal's identity? Some suggest it was an attempt to distance himself from reality, to make himself look less culpable. Others think it points to something darker. Perhaps prejudice or bias played a role in his decision to pull the trigger. And then there's the money issue. When questioned, Ridges admitted he didn't have any cash on him that morning. No money to pay for services, yet he was carrying a loaded handgun. Why? Was this always part of his plan, or did fear and desperation drive him to violence? Investigators haven't ruled out robbery as a possible motive, though they're still exploring all angles. What we do know is this: Ridges' actions raise more questions than answers. Did he set out to harm Jamal from the start, or was this a crime born out of panic and poor decisions? Either way, the result was the same: a life tragically cut short. One of the most striking aspects of the investigation is how quickly detectives identified Ridges as their suspect. Advanced technology allowed them to track his movements almost in real time. After shooting Jamal, Ridges took her car, drove it around the opposite side of the apartment complex, parked it, and went back inside his unit. He likely thought he was covering his tracks, but what he didn't realize was that detectives were already onto him. Using data from her phone and other sources, they pinpointed his location as he entered the casino. That level of precision is remarkable, especially given the timeline. Within 11 hours of the murder, Ridges was in handcuffs. Justice may not always be fast, but in this case, it felt almost immediate. Still, controversies linger. For example, Ridges' claim that he didn't know Jamal was transgender has been met with skepticism, not just by investigators, but by many following the case. His behavior leading up to the murder suggests otherwise. The fact that he targeted black women, including transgender individuals, raises serious concerns about his true motives. Was this a hate crime disguised as a panicked reaction? Or was it simply a man trying to hide his sexual preferences? These are the kinds of questions that keep people talking, and debating as new details emerge. Now, here's where I want to pause and ask you something. What do you think drove Robert Ridges to commit such a heinous act? Do you believe his claims of ignorance, or does the evidence point to something more sinister? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'm here to engage, answer, and keep the conversation going. Stories like Jamal's deserve to be remembered, discussed, and learned from. Let's do that together. Let's talk about the man at the center of this tragedy, Robert Ridges. At first glance, he might seem like an unlikely suspect. A 28-year-old with no prior criminal record, Ridges didn't fit the profile of someone capable of committing such a heinous act. But as investigators dug deeper, a more complicated picture began to emerge. What they uncovered raises serious questions, not just about Ridges himself, but about the societal forces that may have shaped his action. Ridges allegedly killed Jamal to conceal his sexual preferences. That's what he claimed during interviews, at least. He said he panicked after their encounter, afraid she'd tell others about what transpired between them. But here's the thing. Evidence suggests this wasn't some random spur-of-the-moment decision. Investigators found that Ridges had made over 33 phone calls to sex workers that morning, all targeting black women, including members of the transgender community. 33 calls. Think about that for a second. This wasn't coincidence. It was deliberate. And when you combine that pattern with the fact that he was carrying a stolen Sig Sauer 9 handgun, it starts to look less like panic and more like premeditation. But there's another layer to this story. When questioned, Ridges admitted he didn't have any money on him that day. No cash to pay for services, yet he was armed with a loaded handgun. Why? Was this always part of his plan? Or did financial desperation drive him to violence? Maybe he thought he could intimidate Jamal into letting him go without paying. Or maybe something darker was at play. A combination of fear, prejudice, and entitlement that led him to pull the trigger. The truth remains murky, but one thing is clear. Ridges' actions have left an indelible scar on countless lives. So let's break this down further. Was this a calculated attempt to silence Jamal, or was it a spur of the moment decision driven by fear and prejudice? On one hand, Ridge's behavior leading up to the murder suggests intent. The stolen gun, the targeted calls. It all points to someone who knew exactly what he was doing. On the other hand, his claim of panic can't be entirely dismissed. Maybe he felt cornered, ashamed, or afraid of being exposed. Whatever his reasoning, it doesn't excuse what happened. Killing someone because you're afraid of judgment or exposure isn't self-defense, it's cowardice. And then there's the psychological aspect to consider. What kind of person targets vulnerable individuals, knowing full well the risks they face in their line of work? Ridges didn't just pick anyone. He specifically sought out black women, including transgender women. That choice alone speaks volumes about his mindset. Was it rooted in bias, fetishization, or something else entirely? These are the kinds of questions investigators wrestled with as they pieced together his motives. And while we may never fully understand what drove him to commit this crime, one thing is certain. Ridge's actions reflect larger systemic issues facing marginalized communities today. Now, here's where I want to pause and ask you something. Could this tragedy have been prevented? If Ridges hadn't been carrying a gun, would things have ended differently? Or was this the inevitable result of a society that stigmatizes both sex work and transgender identities? And what does it say about the dangers faced by people like Jamal every single day? These aren't just rhetorical questions. They're urgent, important conversations we need to have if we want to prevent tragedies like this from happening again. Because the reality is, Jamal wasn't just a victim of Robert Ridges. She was also a victim of a system that fails to protect those most at risk. Her death highlights the intersectional challenges faced by transgender women of color. Challenges that include poverty, discrimination, and violence. It's not enough to arrest one man and call it justice. We need to address the root causes that make people like Jamal targets in the first place. So now I want to hear from you. Do you think Ridges acted alone, or could there be more to this story? What do you think drove him to commit such a brutal act? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'm here to engage, answer, and keep the conversation going. Stories like Jamal's deserve to be remembered, discussed, and learned from. Let's do that together. Let's take a moment to talk about the people who are still here, the ones left to pick up the pieces after Jamal's life was taken. Because while we've spent time dissecting the crime, the evidence, and the suspect's motives, it's important to remember that this isn't just a story about what happened. It's also a story about who it happened to, and how her absence has left an unfillable void in the lives of those who loved her. For Jamal's family, the pain of losing her is unbearable. Her Aunt Patricia expressed a mix of anger, sadness, and confusion that many of us can only begin to imagine. "You just want to know why," she said. "Why did you feel like she deserved that?" It's a question that lingers, not just for Patricia, but for anyone who hears Jamal's story. Why did someone decide her life wasn't worth preserving? Why did fear or prejudice outweigh basic humanity? These aren't questions with easy answers, but they're questions that demand to be asked. Her family describes Jamal as someone who brought light into even the darkest moments. She was funny, smart, confident, someone who could walk into a room and make everyone feel seen and valued. Patricia remembers her niece as full of energy, always making people laugh, always finding joy, even when life got hard. "She didn't deserve this," Patricia added, her voice heavy with grief. And she's right, no one does. But the fact that it happened to someone like Jamal, a person described by those closest to her as kind, intelligent, and radiant, makes it all the more devastating. Beyond her immediate circle, Jamal's death has sparked outrage and advocacy within the LGBTQ community. For many, her story is a painful reminder of the dangers faced by transgender individuals every single day. Advocates have pointed out that crimes like this don't happen in isolation. They're part of a larger pattern of violence and discrimination targeting marginalized communities. A balloon release held in Cleveland honored Jamal's memory, celebrating the person she was rather than focusing on how she died. It was a moment of unity, a way for people to come together and say, "We see you, we remember you, we won't let your light fade." But even in their grief, Jamal's family wants something clear. They don't want her remembered for her work as an escort. They want her remembered for the love she shared, the laughter she brought, and the positivity she radiated. As her mother poignantly stated, "She shone a light that will shine forever." Those words carry so much weight because they remind us of something universal, that no matter what line of work someone is in, no matter the circumstances of their life, they deserve safety, dignity, and respect. And yet, here we are, talking about a tragedy that never should have happened. Jamal's death underscores the urgent need for greater acceptance and protection, not just for transgender women, but for anyone living at the intersection of multiple marginalized identities. Her family hopes her story will inspire change, even as they mourn her loss. They're grateful for the outpouring of love and support they've received from across Michigan and beyond, but they also know that nothing can truly take away the pain of losing someone so deeply loved. Now, here's where I want to pause and ask you something. How do we honor victims like Jamal without reducing them to their trauma? How do we channel our anger, sadness, and frustration into meaningful action? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'm here to engage, answer, and keep the conversation going. Stories like Jamal's deserve to be remembered, discussed, and learned from. Let's do that together. Let's talk about what happened after the arrest, the legal process, the public response, and the advocacy efforts that followed. Because while catching Robert Ridges was a crucial step toward justice, it wasn't the end of the story. Not by a long shot. Ridges was arrested within 11 hours of the murder, a testament to the swift and coordinated efforts of law enforcement. He was charged with second-degree murder, felony firearm possession, and carrying a concealed weapon. As of now, he's being held without bond, awaiting trial. For Jamal's family and friends, this brought some measure of relief, knowing that the person responsible was off the streets. But as Patricia Bender, Jamal's aunt, pointed out, it doesn't take away the pain. It's like, she said, you just want to know why. Why did you feel like she deserved that? That question lingers, unanswered, even as the legal system grinds forward. The case quickly drew national attention, sparking outrage and calls for change. Advocacy groups and members of the LGBTQ community rallied around Jamal's memory, using her story to highlight the dangers faced by transgender individuals, especially transgender women of color. It's no secret that violence against this community is alarmingly common, yet often overlooked or underreported. Jamal's death became a rallying cry for stricter laws and better protections. People are demanding action, not just words, and it's hard to argue with them. How many more lives have to be lost before real change happens? One particularly moving tribute took place in Cleveland, where Jamal's family organized a balloon release to honor her memory. It wasn't about how she died. It wasn't about how she died. It was about celebrating who she was, a bright light in the lives of everyone fortunate enough to know her. Her family wants people to remember her laughter, her kindness, her intelligence. They're grateful for the outpouring of love and support they've received from across Michigan and beyond. But they also know that tributes, while meaningful, aren't enough. What they really want, and what so many others want, is systemic change. Media coverage played a big role in keeping Jamal's story alive. Reporters dug into the details, shedding light on not just the crime itself, but also the societal issues surrounding it. One reporter, Christiana Ford, spoke at length with Jamal's family about the impact she had on their lives. She was funny, smart, confident, her aunt said. One of those people who could walk into the darkest room and find some light in it. Those words stuck with viewers, humanizing Jamal in ways headlines alone couldn't. The media also highlighted the broader context. The fact that transgender individuals, particularly black transgender women, face disproportionately high rates of violence. This isn't an isolated incident. It's part of a pattern, one that needs to be addressed urgently. Public outrage over the case has been palpable. Many have taken to social media to express their anger, sadness, and frustration. Some have called out the hypocrisy of a society that claims to value equality but fails to protect its most vulnerable members. Others have focused on the specific circumstances of the crime, questioning whether Ridge's actions were motivated by prejudice, fear, or something else entirely. Whatever the motive, one thing is clear. This shouldn't have happened. No matter what line of work someone is in, no matter their gender identity or background, they deserve safety and dignity. Now, here's where I want to pause and ask you something. Do you think cases like Jamal's get the attention they deserve, or do they often fade into the background, overshadowed by other headlines? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'm here to engage, answer, and keep the conversation going. Stories like Jamal's deserve to be remembered, discussed, and learned from. Let's do that together. Let's take a moment to step back and think about what Jamal's story means, not just for her family, but for all of us. Because while this case might feel like an isolated tragedy, it's really part of something much bigger, something systemic. Something that demands our attention if we ever hope to prevent another life from being lost in the same way. Jamal's death underscores the urgent need for greater acceptance and protection of transgender individuals worldwide. It also highlights the dangers faced by sex workers, particularly those from marginalized communities. These aren't abstract issues. They're real, pressing problems that affect real people every single day. Transgender women of color, like Jamal, face disproportionately high rates of violence. And when you add in the stigma surrounding sex work, the risks only multiply. This isn't about pointing fingers or assigning blame. It's about recognizing the ways society fails its most vulnerable members, and then doing something about it. Think about it. How many more Jamals have to die before we start having these hard conversations? How many more families have to sit through press conferences, asking themselves why someone they loved was taken from them? As Jamal's mother so poignantly said, no matter what line of work she was in, this shouldn't have happened. Those words carry so much weight because they remind us of something universal, that everyone deserves safety, dignity, and respect. No exceptions. But here's the thing, change doesn't happen on its own. It starts with awareness, with education, and with action. If you're moved by Jamal's story, consider supporting organizations working to protect and uplift the UEB. There are groups out there fighting for policy changes, offering resources to transgender individuals, and advocating for safer conditions for sex workers. Even small actions, sharing this video, starting conversations, educating yourself and others, can make a difference. Let's honor Jamal's memory by striving for a safer, more inclusive world. A world where no one has to live in fear simply for being who they are. Now, before we wrap this up, I want to thank you for joining me today as we remember Jamal Broom and shed light on the injustices faced by marginalized communities. Your engagement, whether it's liking, commenting, or sharing, helps keep stories like hers alive. And trust me, these stories matter. They remind us of the human cost of prejudice, stigma, and systemic failure. So if you've got thoughts, theories, or questions about this case, or if you just want to share how Jamal's story impacted you, drop a comment below. Let's keep the conversation going. And since you've stuck around this long, here's a little teaser for what's coming next. If you thought this case was shocking, wait until you hear about the millionaire couple who vanished without a trace. Their story is wild, unsettling, and full of twists you won't see coming. Subscribe now so you don't miss it. I promise you won't regret it. Before we go, let me leave you with this. Stories like Jamal's deserve to be told, remembered, and learned from. But they also demand action. So ask yourself, what can you do to make the world a little safer, a little kinder, a little more just? The answer might surprise you. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Stay safe out there.